Good morning. I'm Ivo Daalder, President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, and this is World Review, a weekly review of what was happening in the news today. I'm very pleased today to be joined by Matt Kaminski, the Editor-in-Chief of Politico. Matt, wonderful to have you.
Great to be here, Ivo.
Also with us is Gideon Rachman, the Chief Foreign Affairs Commentator for the Financial Times. Gideon, welcome.
Hi.
And Carla and Robbins, the Marx Faculty Director at Brewer College, an Adjunct Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, and former writer and reporter for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. Welcome, Carla. Well, a lot of things happening this week. Let's start off with this issue of Michael Flynn. While most of the world and all of the country is talking about masking, the fact that we need to put masks on, Washington seems to be all in the titters about unmasking. Carla, what's this all about?
Unmasking. Well, it's a threefer. It's obviously a diversionary tactic, one of many from the rather shocking and negligent mismanagement of the pandemic by this administration. It's one more assault on the intelligence community in an attempt to discredit the Russia investigation. More on that to come in the next few months, one suspects. And now that Ukraine-gate didn't go anywhere, we've got Obama-gate, and it's an attempt to blame Biden for his shocking assaults on civil liberties and what about her emails? I mean, all of these things are going on. Now, what is masking? Masking is an unmasking. I hadn't even put that together. It was very clever, Ivo. What unmasking is, under the surveillance laws, when the NSA or any intelligence organization is surveilling a foreign person, in this case, we believe it was the Russian ambassador in Washington, any American citizen who was being listened to or being discussed is masked in the transcript that is gotten. This is an attempt to protect them, but people who have security clearances can request to have them unmasked or their name revealed. Who is person one, American person one? And what happened this week is, or actually last week, was the acting director of national intelligence suddenly declassified a bunch of requests that turned out to be focused on Michael Flynn, the former national security advisor, the briefest national security advisor in history, a man who pled guilty twice, who also suddenly had the charges dropped against him by Barr. And this has turned into Obamagate. I mean, Trump yesterday said that Obama should be hauled in front of the Senate to answer for this terrible, terrible thing. So it's a threefer. They all fit together in this absolutely fabulous way. And I was just looking at Twitter, and Trump is going on and on and on about how this is the greatest political crime in history.
Matt, while the rest of the country is trying to figure out how to deal with a disease that has killed probably 100,000 Americans in a few short months, and while we're debating about how to get out of the deepest depression that the country has been in 80 years or more, Washington seems to be preoccupied with this, faux scandal that is going on. How does it look from your perch there?
Well, I think once again, Donald Trump quite capably is setting the terms of the political debate in this country. And I think, he, as Carla pointed out, this is it's always good to have a diversion from unhappy news where things don't necessarily look good from your point of view. I think here he may have hit on something which is going to run longer than some of the other attempts in recent weeks to try and turn the attention somewhere else. The Russia scandal as such is coming back, and there are sort of enough questions about the way things were handled in December of 2016 and 17 for this to have fuel going forward. I think the Mueller report, even John Brennan was surprised about how little there was in there. There will be questions that will be raised about what led such senior people in the U.S. government at the time, based on a dossier that the government knew was essentially political opposition research, filtered, via Russian disinformation. What led them to have the FBI launch a major counterintelligence investigation? I don't think there's any evidence of a great plot or anything, but there's enough there to keep this going. And what this means is that Trump really decides what we're talking about. And I think it's also remarkable to see 2.5 months into the Corona crisis that, we thought that the Corona crisis, that this may be the end of the burlesque era in American politics, that this will unify the country. It's time to get serious, really sort of address real serious issues. And a politician like Trump is completely misplaced in this current environment. That may be true, we'll see in November. But for now, he has managed to really polarize the country. And I think for him, polarization is a winning strategy. And that is the firm belief in people in the White House, that he cannot unify, but he can polarize. And here we are.
Can I just make one point,
sure,
which is that the particular transcripts, and we haven't seen them, but the particular transcripts in which Flynn's name everyone was focused on was conversations between Flynn during the transition and the Russian ambassador in Washington, and particularly a conversation on the day in which the Obama administration announced sanctions for meddling in the US election. And this is, to my mind, a completely legitimate request for information and a completely legitimate surveillance of, this is an ongoing surveillance and perfectly normal surveillance of the Russian ambassador. And the notion that someone might want to know who American person number one was, and that ultimately that the FBI, he pled guilty twice to lying about this conversation. He lied to the vice president of the United States about this conversation. Now, the problem with this, like the problem with so many of these other things, is it's really, really easy to hype this and very hard to explain this, which is why Matt is right. But, the predicate of these investigations, and we have a lot more coming out because we've got the Barr has, been racing around Europe, creating this notion that somehow there's an enormous CIA trap for the entire Russia investigation. And then there's more of this stuff that they're trying to, have come out for some sort of an October surprise. I spent a lot of time looking at this. There's not a lot of there. Yes, the FBI really blew it on a FISA warrant, but beyond that, I don't think there's a lot of there. Does it play great on Fox News? Absolutely. Is the press going to be smarter than it was in 2016, or are they going to fall for what about her emails? I think that's a really interesting question, and that may in many ways define how this plays out in the campaign. Sorry to interrupt.
No, actually, that last question I want to get back to before we move on to the other topic, but also the other point that Matt raised, I think is appropriate for Gideon, because you have in Britain, of course, a leader who's also came to power on the basis of polarization, very skillfully did so. But it doesn't seem that right now this is Boris Johnson, leading in the same way. He is trying to unify the country and trying to get people together, or am I misreading that?
No, I think, yeah. The atmosphere in Britain is a lot less polarized currently than it was in the United States. That I think a lot of the anger left behind by the referendum is still below the surface, and it bubbles up every now and then, both sides. But the fact that Johnson was able to win an election fairly clearly with a big majority, in a sense, I think took the wind out of the sails of the Remainers. I was one of them, because they'd won twice. And so a lot of the arguments that were made that the first time was people were hoodwinked. It was hard to keep going. And then we have indeed left the European Union, although the actual relationship with the European Union is still to be negotiated and could be a real mess by the end of this year. But for that reason, I think there's a sort of truce. I also think that Johnson's reaction to COVID-19, while it's been very inept in some ways, we also have a very high death rate. We also shut down too late. He has not argued with scientists in public. On the contrary, he's always been flanked by them, has always said, we're going to follow the scientific advice. And he hasn't sort of peddled crazy quack remedies. He hasn't suggested you inject disinfectant into your arm. And indeed, he almost died of it himself. He was in intensive care. And there was an interesting kind of response around that. I mean, I do know a couple of people who were still so bitter around the referendum that they actually said, well, maybe he should die. I actually did hear that. But I think most people, wanted him to recover genuinely. And I think it's marked actually Britain's attitude to the whole COVID epidemic, because if you look at opinion polls, the Brits are much more wary of coming out of lockdown than almost any other country in Europe. And I think that vision of the Prime Minister himself almost being killed by this really rammed home to people that this is really a very, very serious illness. But now he's out. I think there are question marks that are being raised about his ability to run the show effectively. He was never a details guy. He was always a populist and optimist who ran on Brexit. This is something that demands focus, patience, not his best qualities. Plus, he appears to be quite physically run down, and you would be if 3 weeks ago you were in intensive care. And he's also, finally, up against a new Labour leader, Keir Starmer, who is extremely effective in the House of Commons in a way that Jeremy Corbyn just wasn't, and is a former QC, a prosecuting lawyer. In fact, he was head of the Department of Prosecutions. So really the last person you want coming at you in the House of Commons. And without an audience behind him, because it's all being done on Zoom now, normally Johnson would have a lot of baying Tory MPs cheering him on, silencing Starmer, but now it's like a courtroom, it's silent. So Starmer has these 6 questions in which week after week now he's really taken Johnson apart, if that's not too partisan a judgment. And so I think there is some sympathy from Johnson and a recognition that he's doing his best by a lot of people. His best doesn't seem to be really enough. Britain's not having a good crisis. And I think his limitations as Prime Minister are being exposed, although you don't have this partisan bear pit that you have in the United States quite in the same way.
Yeah, I think that is probably a big difference, this polarization where people are entitled to their own facts. To misquote Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who said, of course, that you're entitled to your opinion, but not to your own facts. Let's move on to the next issue. And Gideon, staying with you for a minute, we had last week a ruling by the German Constitutional Court, which affects the capacity of the EU and the European Bank and the European Union to address the huge financial and economic crisis that now besets not only the United States, but also the Eurozone, and indeed all European countries. I think the report is an expectation of a decline in EU GDP of over 7% for 2020. This is a legal constitutional issue that has huge political implications. Tell us about it.
Yeah, huge political and economic implications, because essentially it actually, although it does bear on what the ECB will be able to do in response to COVID, it's actually a response to what they did during the financial crisis, where the ECB did something similar to the Fed. They intervened massively in the markets. They bought huge numbers of bonds. They built up their balance sheet in a way that was regarded as crucial to prevent there being another financial crisis in Europe, and particularly to protect Italy from default. And that always caused enormous unhappiness in Germany. There have been a number of court cases around that. And finally, the German court, which had sort of tiptoed up to the edge of challenging the European Central Bank and the European courts, but never quite done it, has now done it. It's said that it's disputed a judgment by the European Court of Justice, which said that what the European Central Bank was doing was legal, and said, actually, we think it's gone beyond both the central bank's legal powers, essentially. And that has both economic and political implications. Economically, it raises questions over whether the ECB can continue to intervene in the markets in the way it's been doing. And if it can't, does that mean that you'll pretty soon have a financial panic because people will not think the European Central Bank doesn't stand behind Italy anymore and the spreads will widen and all that? That's a big question. But there's also this political question, which is essentially, as far as the pro-Europeans and Brussels are concerned, this is a kind of act of rebellion similar to the kind of stuff that happened before the American Civil War. People have even drawn that analogy, where you've got a state saying that it doesn't accept the central authority, that it can nullify the rulings of the European Court of Justice. Now, the Germans say that's not what they're doing, that they're actually arguing about who has the right to rule on particular aspects. That they say the ECJ, of course, has supremacy over European law, but that it's exceeded the bounds of European law. But anyway, it's a hell of a mess, particularly because this isn't, obviously a relatively small state. It's not Slovakia or Ireland. This is the largest country in the European Union, the biggest by population, by economy size, by contribution to the European Union budget. So the European Union is now being urged to essentially take on Germany, to sue them in court for infringing European law. But can they really afford an absolute confrontation with the most important country that makes up the European Union? I think probably not. So look, my instinct is they'll fudge it in the end. They'll find a way around this. They'll find a kind of ruling and a compromise, and that this is just a shot across the bow by the European court, by the German courts. But it's possible it will get out of hand, and it's also possible that the markets will misinterpret it and begin to panic, and that you'll have a kind of a renewed financial crisis.
Fudging is the European way, obviously, for many decades. I think Brussels could not be in a weaker position than it is right now. I think this has not been a good crisis for the EU as such. Following Brexit, there was not a unified response to Corona. You've had this upsurge of Eurosceptic sentiment in Italy, which feels really burned by the way it was treated by the rest of the continent. So Brussels, I don't think, feels very confident to sort of take on what in effect are the two most popular institutions in Germany, which is the highest court as number one, followed soon after by the Bundesbank as number two. And at the end, Germany pays the bills in Europe. So a bit like the Greek crisis 10 years ago, there's things that Brussels can say and other European countries can say, but really it is, when it comes to matters of signing checks, it is the Germans who have the final say.
Carla, do you see?
I have a question, which is, so for all of those little countries that, like the Hungarys of the world, who've been saying you are not the boss of me to the European Court of Justice on things like refugee quotas and all of that, are they going to take this as further license? I mean, basically, Article 7 doesn't exist anyway. I mean, are they just rubbing their hands and saying more chaos?
Totally, they already have, and so it's one of the concerns is that both the Polish and Hungarian governments have hailed this as evidence that they too can ignore the fiat of Brussels, etc., which worries even some of the people who back the German court. Indeed, the head of the German court, a guy called Huber, said all the wrong people are applauding, by which he meant the Polish government, because there is a distinction, actually. I mean, I think that nobody questions the independence of the German court or the integrity of German democracy. And there are big questions about that, both the independence of the courts and the integrity of the Polish and Hungarian democracies. But there's no doubt that they will attempt to abuse this decision or to seize upon it in a slightly, if I can say it, Trumpian fashion. They'll say, oh, there's this thing happening out there that proves we were right all along. Now, it's a slightly distorted argument, but it's no doubt it's helpful to them.
And so in the infringement, I mean, if you look at what's happened, with Hungary and Poland, in which they've had incredible abuses, and including the packing the court issue in Poland, there's a process here in triggering Article 7. There's a warning, there's a negotiation, there's all these things. Do you think it will get that far in which the steps will be taken, or to prove that there really is a process under the treaties, or do you think that the fudge will predate that?
I'm not sure. Matt might have a better view of that. My sense is that the Europeans, having started down this road rather reluctantly, actually, there was a lot of hesitation in Brussels because they could see how difficult it would be, that they will feel compelled to try to take the Poles on. But I don't have a sense of exactly how that process will play out. I mean, I think in the end, the Poles will find a way of brushing it aside. I'm not really sure what the sanction the EU has. I suppose they could eventually try to withdraw Poland's voting rights or something through the European Council, but then they would be protected by the Hungarians. That is a slight problem for the European Union. When you've got two rogue countries.
I think what I was asking is, will they go through the motions with the Germans too? Will they actually?
Look, that's the argument that's being made, that you have to do this, otherwise it looks unfair. I think they might, but I think going through the motions is the correct phrase. I think they might start infringement proceedings in the belief and the hope that it doesn't actually come to a court and a ruling by the European Court of Justice, because before that you have what's known as a sort of process of dialogue, where the various warring institutions try to settle their differences it's kind of like a divorce court, not going to arbitration, rather to an actual divorce. I think the hope is, when I said fudge, that's the kind of thing I could see happening as they start this process. The German courts say, okay, we've made our point. The Europeans find a way of meeting them halfway, and the whole show goes on. On the other hand, although I do think that's probably the likeliest outcome, this action by the court was quite bellicose by their standards. And it suggests that maybe they're not really up for this old way of doing things, that they really do want to take a stand. And if they do, then we could be in new territory.
Yeah, I think that's certainly a possibility. It has this feeling of a pivot point, that either the thing unravels even further, and we will look back in history as Brexit and as the beginning of a long-term process, or it is, in more traditional European senses, people say, no, we can't go down this path. We need to figure out a new way and muddle through in the right kind of way. And right now, for the first time, you can see him going either way, in some ways. Matt, I wanted to shift gears to 7,000 kilometers further to the east from Brussels, Afghanistan. We saw some horrific violence in the last week, and just 2 months ago, it was 3 months ago, I guess it was the Secretary of State flew to Dubai to be present at the signing of a peace agreement between the United States and the Taliban, and that would lead to a peace process that would lead to American troops and presumably non-American troops coming home. And here we are with a level of violence that we've seen before in Afghanistan, but we weren't supposed to be seeing after the peace process. Where are we? What's happening in this place?
Well, it's a reminder of two things. One, coronavirus is not the only story in the world, and there are other things that we should be thinking and worrying about. And it's a reminder of a depressing reminder to me that you've had essentially Afghanistan be at war since 1973, and this and our interest in this place has sort of ebbed and flowed. The late 70s, obviously President Obama with his surge in 2010. There's a lot of focus in Afghanistan, and fundamentally nothing has been fixed. You have a very weak state with an American-supported government. There's a pretty firm and I think convincing belief that the minute that we pull out, that will probably collapse in on itself. The Trump administration wants a deal. President Trump is a deal maker. That's the title of his numerous books. Would love to have this, probably less important now than it was 3 months ago to kind of have a clear foreign policy win. So they negotiated with the Taliban without the direct involvement of the Afghan government. And there was a tacit commitment that, that violence should go down, although there was not a formal ceasefire. They are in the midst of negotiating a prisoner swap, so there are sort of reasons why you may see violence as a leverage point. But I think what happened this week in Kabul, where some militia, and it's not clear who, the Taliban saying it was not us, it could have been the Islamic State, attacked a maternity ward and laid siege to a maternity ward for about 4 hours, killing 16, I think, women, mostly young mothers, and even 2 infants. So, and why is this happening? Because I guess people are feeling that there is something to fight over this, whatever the next state is here. I think, and lastly, it's a reminder that, a place like Afghanistan really abhors a vacuum. And anytime that you create a vacuum, whether it's the U.S. pulling out or someone's going to fill it. And unfortunately, it is violence that ends up filling it in Afghanistan most of the time.
I think it was a few weeks ago that Pompeo flew to Kabul for an 8-hour visit in order to try to tell the Afghans it was time to to implement the peace agreement, and if not, we would not only pull out our troops, we're going to pull our money away, doesn't seem to have had any impact on the situation there, Carla.
Well, they, while there wasn't a formal ceasefire, I mean, they were supposed to, this was the testing moment in which the Taliban were supposed to show what they could deliver around the country, and if they could control their own people. I mean, is this, or I think Matt's right. I mean, I think the expectation was always going to be that, 2 hours after the coalition left, that there were going to be people hanging off the struts of helicopters on the embassy, which is pretty horrifying. I think the only question here is, I think we're not utterly certain who did this. And there was this claim that an ISIS leader had been captured or killed. I can't remember, right before this. Maybe there's this possibility, but it doesn't really matter. Ultimately, I mean, the Afghan government itself has been feeling really squeezed out of the process, and not a lot of enthusiasm for moving forward with something that they have no control over. And within the US government itself, within the US administration, the only person who really wants to get out of Afghanistan is Donald Trump. And his, attention is focused otherwise. So I think that they're pretty much on their own, unless I'm misreading this. Am I misreading that, Matt?
No, that's absolutely right.
So an impact, to step back for a second. I mean, of course, the United States, as Matt said, we were there in the late 1970s and the 80s in terms of supporting the Mujahideen, which turned out to be part of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in the end. So that was a mixed message, let's put it that way. And we've been involved since 2001. It's almost 20 years now that we have been in Afghanistan. And what I'm interested in is, Gideon, from your perspective as an outside observer, the fact that America has been involved in this endless war for 19 years without really having any positive impact. What's the perception that does to American power and American capability internationally? Is it it's just one of these things that doesn't really matter? Or is it just demonstrates the underlying impotence of the United States or some other version? How does the reality of Afghanistan and the huge investment that has been made by the United States, indeed by many allies too, and not getting anything out of it, what does it do to the perception of power?
I think it's something in between the two that you describe. I think that, on one level, to the extent that people still remember that America's in Afghanistan, and I don't think one should, it's not very much, dominant in the news, to put it mildly. Those who think about it know that this is a place that people, has never really been conquered by any foreign power, from the British in the 19th century. The Russians failed there, and the Americans also appear to have failed there, along with their NATO allies. But I think that it's part of a broader picture dating for the last really 20 years, since the turn of the millennium, where this absolute certainty and the unstoppability of American power has been chipped away in a number of ways. I think probably even more important than Afghanistan was Iraq, because that was so much more high profile, so much more divisive in the West. And the failure was in a way almost more high profile. So the sense that America created a mess in Iraq and has never really put it right. And then you follow on for the way in which America, in consequence, engages or doesn't engage with the world. You have the Obama administration's reluctance to get involved in Syria, and then the Russians becoming involved. And I think that's a very important moment for the sense that actually, even if the Americans had always, or often blundered or often got things wrong, they were still unquestionably the dominant power in the greater Middle East, the only one that for a period was willing and able to intervene in military ways. Then America doesn't get involved in Syria, and Russia does, and is back. And there's symbolic pictures of Russian troops moving into bases the Americans had recently vacated. And then, of course, the vacuum in Libya, where again Obama famously wanted to lead from behind. Maybe his instincts were right, because there was another vacuum, another set of chaos created. So I think cumulatively, you take together Iraq, Libya, Syria, Afghanistan, you've got 4 demonstrations where America's tried different things: intervention, non-intervention, But the collective sense is that a region, a greater Middle East, if you can use that phrase, which was essentially dominated by the United States, no longer is. And that raises questions not just about America's engagement with that region, but with the world. I don't think you would see, for example, China being quite as cheeky in the way it's sort of pushing the United States in the Pacific if it were not for the sense that America had failed in the Middle East.
So I'm going to come back to that, Gideon, but let's push that point a little bit. So the idea that the United States is retreating, or at least seen as retreating, has led to this idea that China is filling the vacuum internationally through its Belt and Road Initiative, and of course the COVID response and crisis, where the United States has not led internationally. The Chinese are seen as trying to do so, but frankly failing. Because of the materials that they're providing, are the masks that are not up to standards, the tests that don't work, etc. You have to sense that the two big powers are vying for a competition, but neither are succeeding in getting anybody to be on their side. Is that a way that there's more chaos rather than power, and that other countries are saying, wait a minute, maybe we need to step up? Countries like Australia and Canada, Japan, maybe even Britain, in a post-Brexit way, to say we need to do more in order to maintain the international system, because the big powers are no longer doing that.
No, I think they'd like to think they were capable of that, but also there is a sense we're aware of the limitations of our power. There is none of the middle powers. If you wanted to say, the UK, France, Germany, Australia, Canada, has anything like the disposable power of the United States or China inside the economy, and they're not organized. They may share roughly the same sorts of instincts. I think generally they tend to be countries that are interested in this horrible phrase, the rules-based international order, because they don't have the temptation that the US or the China have to say, well, the rules of the Lilliputians, we're powerful. We can just get what we want by imposing our power on others. I think that the countries in the tier below know that a world in which it's basically power that counts rather than some rule book is not going to be one that's congenial for them. So they have a joint interest in supporting international institutions, whether it's the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, etc. But actually turning that joint interest into actionable, into being a bloc that can actually work, not really effective. I mean, the EU is one possibility, but as we were just saying, the EU is pretty divided itself and suffered a big blow through Brexit. But I mean, I think a final thought is that, one way of thinking of if the middle powers can't act coherently, and I think by and large they can't, we've moved from a period where they used to think, well, we don't really have to choose between the United States and China because it's a globalized world where we're allowed to trade with everybody and that's all fine, to this much more confrontational world where they're thinking, okay, well, we're under pressure from both Beijing and Washington. Maybe we're going to have to choose. But actually, neither's looking particularly attractive choice. I mean, I think for the liberal democracies, in the end, obviously, they have to go with the United States. But Trump's America is not offering leadership, and actually at times seems to regard Germany as much of a threat as China. So it's not a very congenial partner. But at the same time, China is becoming much more overtly threatening. There'd been, 2 or 3 years ago when Trump came in, I'd heard from some European officials, well, maybe we should actually be working with China because they're closer to us on trade, they're closer to us on climate change, that kind of thing. But now, Xi's China is very aggressive. For example, when the Australians call for an international inquiry, they've into the origins of COVID, rather than saying, well, it's an interesting idea and kind of putting it under the carpet, they began to threaten Australia, and I think they've stopped imports of beef and wine from Australia as a way of saying, look, not only do we not like you saying this, we're actually going to punish you for that. So China has no soft power at all, and so the middle powers are really caught between two big powers that don't look like congenial partners at the moment.
I think it's important that we don't overstate the mood music around Trump has obviously changed around the transatlantic alliance, around America's role in the world. But there's also a great deal of continuity between administrations. America has interests. It also has presidents. They come and go every 4 to 8 years. And I think if you really look at what America has done in the world under Trump in terms of either military deployment or even engagement on trade, as much as anti sort of free trade Trump is, it's arguably that they've done as much, if not even more, than the Obama administration that was sort of beloved by the rest of the world. You talk to the Ukrainians, they've gotten a lot more out of this administration than out of the Obama administration. I'm sure I haven't counted, but I would be surprised if there are not more countries with American boots on the ground right now than there were 4 years ago. And that raises a question about Afghanistan, where I think you have the pull of American politics versus the pull of American interests. We've had troops in Korea and Germany for almost 70 years now, in Korea a bit less. There's a perfectly good argument that you can make that, look, let's set aside the arguments of Iraq post 9/11. There's a reason why we need some presence in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in West and Central Africa, because that is an American interest, as I think Claudia mentioned, as Carla mentioned with Syria. If America leaves, then really bad actors come in. It's also could be a moment post-COVID where either this administration or another administration could say, actually, this is the time we push back against China for the reasons that, China's a little bit of an unpleasant character with Sir President Xi, but also you're going to see a real concerted shift away from, the CEOs that you talk to around now saying, we kind of goofed in being so dependent on China for our supply chains. We really have to look elsewhere. There's going to be, I think, a diversification of economic interest away from China, which will presumably weaken China too. So I guess I wouldn't turn the page on the American century just yet.
Carla, do you see the opportunity here for the United States to rally its longstanding partners and allies in a concerted strategy to counter Chinese power? Has the day come, given that the Chinese may have overreacted and certainly misplaced the COVID crisis?
Well, I think that you will certainly, the Republican Party and the Trump campaign is gearing itself up for going after China hammer and tongs for the entire campaign. So they want to put a consistent message out there. We were going to talk about Israel. Pompeo, one of the things that he was doing when he went to Israel was to talk about, please don't let them build your ports, don't let them build desalination plants. That said, and I think this goes to the broader point of that Matt was talking about and Gideon was talking about, there's a shocking lack of consistency in American policy around the world, hortatory policy. Yes, there may be consistency in our presence, but countries don't know what it is that Trump wants or what it is that we stand for anymore. Yes, there was a huge amount of anxiety about Obama's failure to lead in Syria and a sense of retreat even in Europe. But one day, Trump sounds like he's about to go to war with the Chinese, and the next day he's talking about his absolutely fabulous relationship with Xi Jinping. And it's the lack of consistency. And even within the campaign itself, they're investing an enormous amount in these commercials, but they don't know if Trump's going to come out the next day and what he's going to say about Xi and what he's going to say about China. So I think it's, when we talk about the U.S. as this indispensable nation and the leadership, it is Gideon's right that small, middle powers, they don't have smart bombs, and they also don't have, they have to band together, but there's basic things that they don't have. But there's this notion of consistent American leadership has also really been fundamental. And I think the fundamental weakness of this administration is a lack of vision, a lack of clarity. And even within the administration itself, nobody can make any plans because they don't know what the president's going to do the next day.
Carla, you mentioned Israel and Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has made 2 trips since the beginning of the COVID crisis. One was to Afghanistan, which we talked about a little earlier. And then there was this 8-hour trip to Israel just on Wednesday. What was that all about? Well,
he was masked when he got off the plane. And then he unmasked.
Stars and Stripes, I believe.
It was Stars and Stripes, yes. So the official reason he went, they said, was to talk about Iran. And the Israelis believe or said that the Iranians are messing around doing cyber attacks. And the other one was to talk about Chinese investment in infrastructure. And then there is the question of the annexation plan. Now, the proximate cause why he went and traveling in the middle of a pandemic is that the new government was supposed to be sworn in yesterday, and now that's been kicked back to Sunday because the Likud party is still trying to figure out how many cabinet seats. But this is supposed to be an emergency/unity government in which Netanyahu is going to run it for 18 months, and then you're going to have more centrist Benny Gantz is going to take over after that. But what in this deal Netanyahu got is that he gets to make the ultimate decision on whether or not to move forward with this Trump-blessed plan for annexing 30% of the occupied West Bank. Now, the Americans seem to want to go full steam ahead for it, and there seems to be a disagreement among analysts about what message Pompeo was sending about annexation. The New York Times was saying that he sent a yellow light. They based that analysis on an interview that Pompeo gave to Israel's Hayom, which is a pro-Netanyahu paper that said that Gantz and Netanyahu have to work together on this. This would suggest slow down, because Gantz really doesn't want to do this at all. But other people, including Haaretz, which I tend to have obviously I love the New York Times work there, but Haaretz is saying that it's a clear green light still to move ahead. How fast he moves ahead, it seems that Netanyahu's one of his big motivations in life is this man's about to go on trial. He's got three corruption trials coming up, one of which starts on May 24th. This is a great diversionary tactic as well. He says he's going to start discussing this with his cabinet on July 1st, and then the King of Jordan just gave an interview to Der Spiegel saying that this is going to lead to a massive conflict. So do I believe Pompeo went there to tell them to slow down? I certainly hope so.
Matt, what do you? There's a domestic political issue, of course, for the United States as well. One of the reasons that the president has been pushing this plan is because of the strong support he has in the Christian evangelical community, which is very pro-Israel, and they're very strong voices in parts of the American Jewish community, of course, as well, pushing for this. Is that what's behind it, or are we reading too much into it?
I mean, it hasn't really dominated the headlines, has it? And I guess these days, nothing lives for longer than, has a half-life of a few hours, and so we move on. But I think it's very hard to imagine that foreign policy will in any way shape this campaign, with one huge exception, which is China. But China's basically become a domestic policy issue, and will be. You're going to hear about China from the spring through election day in sort of various ways. So I don't think that Israel, it's hard to imagine that it carries anywhere near the sort of weight that it has in the past because of the corona crisis, and because so much of our kind of collective attention has turned toward China. I think China has become such a polarizing issue too. You can hardly say or write anything about China without being attacked by one or the other side and so it's sort of become a little almost like the Soviet Union at some point in the 1980s.
Or even the 1950s as part of that. Matt, Carla, you have 30 seconds left.
Well, for the base, though, I mean, it may not be a campaign issue, but it is one of the reasons why the evangelicals stick with him. Yeah,
no, absolutely. Carla, Matt, Gideon, thanks all. We didn't get to all the topics we wanted to discuss, but we got to a lot of them. Always wonderful to have you. This was World Review, and we see you next week at Chicago time at 10 o'clock on Friday. Thank you so much, Matt, Gideon, Carla. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Be safe.
All the best.
Bye, everybody.